Chapter 4. Man, a being of volitional consciousness. The principle of volition. One of the characteristics of the majority of modern psychological theories, aside from the arbitrariness of so many of their claims, is their frequently ponderous irrelevance. The cause, both of the irrelevance and of the arbitrariness, is the evident belief of their exponents that one can have a science of human nature while consistently ignoring man's most significant and distinctive attributes. Psychology, today, is in desperate need of epistemological rehabilitation. It should be unnecessary, for example, to point out what is wrong with the attempt to prove that all learning is of a random, trial-and-error kind by placing a rat into a maze where random, trial-and-error learning is all that is possible, then adducing the rat's behavior as evidence for the theory. It should be still less requisite to point out what is wrong with accepting the underlying premise of such experiments, the groundless and flagrantly unempirical notion that the learning process in man is to be understood through a study of the behavior of rats. In the writings of modern psychologists, whether or not the writers happen to show a predilection for the study of rats, or pigeons or earthworms, man is the entity most conspicuously absent. One can read many textbooks today and never learn that man has the ability to think. If the fact is acknowledged at all, it is dismissed as unimportant. One would not learn from these books that man's distinctive form of consciousness is conceptual, nor that this is a fact of crucial significance. One would not learn that man's biologically distinguishing attribute and his basic means of survival is his rational faculty. The relation of man's reason to his survival is the first of two basic principles of man's nature which are indispensable to an understanding of his psychology and behavior. The second is that the exercise of his rational faculty, unlike an animal's use of his senses, is not automatic, that the decision to think is not biologically programmed in man, that to think is an act of choice. This principle was formulated by Ayn Rand as follows: the key to human nature is the fact that man is a being of volitional consciousness. Reason does not work automatically, thinking is not a mechanical process, the connections of logic are not made by instinct. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic, the function of your mind is not. In any hour and issue of your life, you are free to think or to evade that effort. But you are not free to escape from your nature, from the fact that reason is your means of survival, so that for you, who are a human being, the question, to be or not to be, is the question, to think or not to think. One in her subsequent writing, Miss Rand does not provide a theoretical elaboration of this statement. Let us proceed to provide it here. A full exposition of the principle of volition requires that we begin by placing the issue in a wider biological context, that we consider certain basic facts about the nature of living organisms.
An organism's life is characterized by and dependent upon a constant process of internally generated action. This is evident in the process of growth and maturation, in the process of self-healing, and in the actions of the organism in relation to its environment. The goal-directedness of living action is its most striking feature. This is not meant to imply the presence of purpose on the non-conscious levels of life, but rather to stress the significant fact that there exists in living entities a principle of self-regulating action, and that action moves toward, and normally results in, the continued life of the organism. For example, the complex processes involved in metabolism, or the remarkable self-repairing activities of living structures, or the integrated orchestration of the countless separate activities involved in the normal process of an organism's physical maturation. Organic self-regulation is the indisputable, fascinating, and challenging phenomenon at the base of the science of biology. Life exists on different levels of development and complexity, from the single cell to man. As life advances from simpler to higher levels, one may distinguish three forms or categories of self-regulatory activity, which I shall designate as the vegetative level of self-regulation, the conscious behavioral level, the self-conscious level. The vegetative level is the most primitive. All the physiological biochemical processes within a plant, by which the plant maintains its own existence, are of this order. This pattern of self-regulatory activity is operative within a single cell and in all higher life forms. It is operative in the non-conscious physiological biochemical processes within the bodies of animals and men, as in metabolism, for example. The conscious behavioral level of self-regulation appears with the emergence of consciousness in animals. The vegetative level continues to operate within the animal's body, but a new, higher level is required to protect and sustain the animal's life as the animal moves through its environment. This level is achieved by the animal's power of awareness. Its senses provide it with the knowledge it needs to hunt, to move around obstacles, to flee from enemies, etc. Its ability to be conscious of the external world enables the animal to regulate and direct its motor activity. Deprived of its senses, an animal could not survive. For all living entities that possess it, consciousness, the regulator of action, is the basic means of survival. The sensory perceptual level of an animal's consciousness does not permit it, of course, to be aware of the issue of life and death as such. But given the appropriate physical environment, the animal's sensory perceptual apparatus and its pleasure-pain mechanism function automatically to protect its life. If its range of awareness cannot cope with the conditions that confront the animal, it perishes. But, within the limit of its powers, its consciousness serves to regulate its behavior in the direction of life. Thus, with the faculty of locomotion and the emergence of consciousness in animals, a new form of self-regulatory activity appears in nature, a new expression of the biological principle of life.
In man, both life and consciousness reach their most highly developed form. Man, who shares with animals the sensory perceptual mode of consciousness, goes beyond it to the conceptual mode, to the level of abstractions, principles, explicit reasoning, and self-consciousness. Unlike animals, man has the ability to be explicitly aware of his own mental activities, to question their validity, to judge them critically, to alter or correct them. Man is not rational automatically. He is aware of the fact that his mental processes may be appropriate or inappropriate to the task of apprehending reality. His mental processes are not, to him, an unalterable given. In addition to the two previous forms of self-regulating activity, man exhibits a third, the power to regulate the action of his own consciousness. In one crucial respect, the nature of this regulatory activity differs radically from the two previous ones. On the vegetative and conscious behavioral levels, the self-regulation is wired into the system. A living organism is a complex integrate of hierarchically organized structures and functions. The various components are controlled in part by their own regulators and in part by regulators on higher levels of the hierarchy. For example, the rhythm of the heart is directly under the control of the heart's own pacemaker system. The pacemaker system is regulated by the autonomic nervous system and by hormones. These are regulated by centers in the brain. The ultimate regulative principle, inherent in and controlling the entire system of subregulators, from the nervous system to the heart down to the internal action of a single cell, is, clearly, the life of the organism, i.e., the requirements of the organism's survival. The organism's life is the implicit standard or goal that provides the integrating principle of the organism's internal actions. This ultimate regulator is programmed into the organism by nature, so to speak, as are all the subregulators. The organism has no choice in the matter. Just as, on the vegetative level, the specific nature of the self-regulation, the controlling and integrating principle, is wired into the system, so, in a different form, this is equally true of the conscious behavioral level in animals. The ultimate standard and goal, the animal's life, is biologically programmed, through the animal's sensory perceptual apparatus and its pleasure-pain mechanism, to regulate its behavior. Now consider the self-conscious level of self-regulation.
The basic function of consciousness, in animals and in man, is awareness, the maintenance of sensory and/or conceptual contact with reality. On the plane of awareness that man shares with animals, the sensory perceptual plane, the integrative process is automatic, i.e., wired in to the nervous system. In the brain of a normal human being, sensations, primary sensory inputs, are automatically integrated into perceptions. On the sensory perceptual level, awareness is the controlling and regulating goal of the integrative process, by nature's programming. This is not true of the conceptual level of consciousness. Here, the regulation is not automatic, not wired in to the system. Conceptual awareness, as the controlling goal of man's mental activity, is necessary to his proper survival, but it is not implanted by nature. Man has to provide it. He has to select that purpose. He has to direct his mental effort and integrate his mental activity to the goal of conceptual awareness, by choice. The capacity of conceptual functioning is innate, but the exercise of this capacity is volitional. To engage in an active process of thinking, to abstract, conceptualize, relate, infer, to reason, man must focus his mind. He must set it to the task of active integration. The choice to focus, in any given situation, is made by choosing to make awareness one's goal, awareness of that which is relevant in the given context. One activates and directs the thinking process by setting the goal, awareness, and that goal acts as the regulator and integrator of one's mental activity. The goal of awareness is set by giving oneself, in effect, the order, grasp this. That this goal is not wired in to man's brain by nature, as the automatic regulator of mental activity, scarcely needs to be argued. One does not need to design special laboratory experiments in order to demonstrate that thinking is not an automatic process, that man's mind does not automatically pump conceptual knowledge, when and as his life requires it, as his heart pumps blood. The mere fact of being confronted with physical objects and events will not force man to abstract their common properties, to integrate his abstractions, to apply his knowledge to each new particular he encounters. Man's capacity to default on the responsibility of thinking is too easily observable. He must choose to focus his mind. He must choose to aim at understanding. On the conceptual level, the responsibility of self-regulation is his.
The act of focusing pertains to the operation of a man's consciousness, to its method of functioning, not to its content. A man is in focus when and to the extent that his mind is set to the goal of awareness, clarity, intelligibility, with regard to the object of his concern, i.e., with regard to that which he is considering or dealing with or engaged in doing. To sustain that focus with regard to a specific issue or problem is to think. To let one's mind drift in will-less passivity, directed only by random impressions, emotions, or associations, or to consider an issue without genuinely seeking to understand it, or to engage in an action without a concern to know what one is doing, is to be out of focus. What is involved here is not an issue of the degree of a man's intelligence or knowledge, nor is it an issue of the productiveness or success of any particular thinking process. Nor is it an issue of the specific subject matter with which the mind may be occupied. It is an issue of the basic regulating principle that directs the mind's activity. Is the mind controlled by the goal of awareness, or by something else, by wishes, fears, or the pull of lethargic passivity? To be in focus is to set one's mind to the purpose of active cognitive integration. But the alternative confronting man is not simply optimal consciousness or absolute unconsciousness. There are different levels of awareness possible to man's mind, determined by the degree of his focus. This will be manifested in A. The clarity or vagueness of his mind's contents. B. The degree to which the mind's activity involves abstractions and principles or is concrete bound. C. The degree to which the relevant wider context is present or absent in the process of thinking. Thus, the choice to focus or to think does not consist of moving from a state of literal unconsciousness to a state of consciousness. This clearly would be impossible. When one is asleep, one cannot suddenly choose to start thinking. To focus is to move from a lower level of awareness to a higher level, to move from relative mental passivity to purposeful mental activity, to initiate a process of directed cognitive integration. In a state of passive, or relatively passive, awareness, a man can apprehend the need to be in full mental focus. His choice is to evade that knowledge or to exert the effort of raising the level of his awareness. The decision to focus and to think, once made, does not continue to direct a man's mind unceasingly thereafter, with no further effort required. Just as the state of full consciousness must be initiated volitionally, so it must be maintained volitionally. The choice to think must be reaffirmed in the face of every new issue and problem. The decision to be in focus yesterday will not compel a man to be in focus today. The decision to be in focus about one question will not compel a man to be in focus about another. The decision to pursue a certain value does not guarantee that a man will exert the mental effort required to achieve it. In any specific thinking process, man must continue to monitor and regulate his own mental activity to keep it on the rails, so to speak. In any hour of his life, He is free to suspend the function of his consciousness, to abandon effort, to default on the responsibility of self-regulation and let his mind drift passively. He is free to maintain only a partial focus, grasping that which comes easily to his understanding and declining to struggle for that which does not.
Man is free not only to evade the effort of purposeful awareness in general, but to evade specific lines of thought that he finds disconcerting or painful. Perceiving qualities in his friends, his wife, or himself that clash with his moral standards, he can surrender his mind to blankness or switch it hastily to some other concern, refusing to identify the meaning or implications of what he has perceived. Dimly apprehending, in the midst of an argument, that he is being ridden by his emotions and is maintaining a position for reasons other than those he is stating, reasons that he knows to be untenable, he can refuse to integrate his knowledge, he can refuse to pause on it, he can push it aside and continue to shout with righteous indignation. Grasping that he is pursuing a course of action that is in blatant defiance of reason, he can cry to himself, in effect, "Who can be sure of anything?" Plunge his mind into fog and continue on his way. In such cases, a man is doing more than defaulting on the responsibility of making awareness his goal, he is actively seeking unawareness as his goal. This is the meaning of evasion. In the choice to focus or not to focus, to think or not to think, to activate the conceptual level of his consciousness or to suspend it, and in this choice alone, is man psychologically free. Man's freedom to focus or not to focus, to think or not to think, is a unique kind of choice that must be distinguished from any other category of choice. It must be distinguished from the decision to think about a particular subject. What a man thinks about, in any given case, depends on his values, interests, knowledge, and context. It must be distinguished from the decision to perform a particular physical action, which again depends on a man's values, interests, knowledge, and context. These decisions involve causal antecedents of a kind which the choice to focus does not. The primary choice to focus, to set one's mind to the purpose of cognitive integration, is causally irreducible, it is the highest regulator in the mental system, it is subject to man's direct, volitional control. In relation to it, all other choices and decisions are sub-regulators.
The capacity of volitional choice presupposes, of course, a normal brain. A condition of disease can render any human faculty inoperative. But this analysis assumes an intact, normally functioning brain and nervous system. To recognize that man is free to think or not to think is to recognize that, in a given situation, a man is able to think and he is able to refrain from thinking. The choice to think, not the process of thinking, but the choice to think, and the process of focusing his mind are an indivisible action, of which man is the causal agent. The choice to focus one's mind is a primary, just as the value sought, awareness, is a primary. It is awareness that makes any other values possible, not any other values that antecede and make awareness possible. Awareness is the starting point and precondition of goal-directed, value-directed, human action, not just another goal or value along the way, as it were. The decision to focus one's mind, to value awareness and make it one's goal, or not to focus, is a basic choice that cannot be reduced further. It must be stressed that volition pertains, specifically, to the conceptual level of awareness. A child encounters the need of cognitive self-regulation when and as he begins to move from the perceptual to the conceptual level, when and as he learns to abstract, to classify, to grasp principles, to reason explicitly. So long as he functions on the sensory perceptual level, he experiences cognition as an effortless process. But when he begins to conceptualize, he is confronted by the fact that this new form of awareness entails mental work, that it requires an effort, that he must choose to generate this effort. He discovers that, on this new level of awareness, he is not infallible, error is possible, cognitive success is not automatically guaranteed to him. Whereas, on the perceptual level, to look is to see, on the conceptual level, to ask a question is not automatically to know the answer, and to know what question to ask is not automatic either. He discovers the continual need to monitor and regulate his mind's activity. A child does not, of course, identify this knowledge verbally or explicitly. But it is implicit in his consciousness, by direct introspective awareness. Just as a man cannot escape the implicit knowledge that the function of his mind is volitional, so he cannot escape the implicit knowledge that he should think, that to be conscious is desirable, that his efficacy as a living entity depends on it. But he is free to act on that knowledge or to evade it. To repeat, nature has not programmed him to think automatically. In some cases, the motive of non-focusing or non-thinking is anti-effort, i.e., a disinclination to exert the energy and accept the responsibility that thinking requires. In other cases, the motive is some wish, desire, or feeling which one wants to indulge and which one's reason cannot sanction, and so one solves the problem by going out of focus. In other cases, the motive is escape from fear, a fear to which one knows one should not surrender, but to which one does surrender, suspending one's consciousness and negating one's knowledge. These motives are not causal imperatives, they are feelings which a man may choose to treat as decisive.
As focusing involves expanding the range of one's awareness, so evasion consists of the reverse process of shrinking the range of one's awareness. Evasion consists of refusing to raise the level of one's awareness when one knows, clearly or dimly, that one should, or of lowering the level of one's awareness when one knows, clearly or dimly, that one shouldn't. To evade a fact is to attempt to make it unreal to oneself on the implicit subjectivist premise that if one does not perceive the fact, it does not exist, or its existence will not matter and will not entail any consequences. Consciousness is man's tool for perceiving and identifying the facts of reality. It is an organ of integration. To focus is to set the integrative process and purposeful motion by setting the appropriate goal, awareness. Non-focus is non-integration. Evasion is willful disintegration, the act of subverting the proper function of consciousness, of setting the cognitive function in reverse and reducing the contents of one's mind to disconnected, unintegrated fragments that are forbidden to confront one another. Man's life and well-being depend upon his maintaining a proper cognitive contact with reality, and this requires a full mental focus, maintained as a way of life. The act of focusing, as a primary mental set, must be distinguished from the act of problem-solving. Problem-solving entails the pursuit of the answer to some specific question. As such, it presupposes a state of focus, but is not synonymous with it. For example, a man who goes for a walk on a sunny day, intent only on the enjoyment of his activity, with no immediate concern for any long-range problems, may still be in mental focus if he knows clearly what he is doing, and if he preserves a fundamental alertness, a readiness for purposeful thought, should the need for it arise. To be in focus does not mean that one must be engaged in the task of problem-solving every moment of one's waking existence. It means that one must know what one's mind is doing. The more consistently and conscientiously a man maintains a policy of being in full mental focus, of thinking, of judging the facts of reality that confront him, of knowing what he is doing and why, the easier and more natural the process becomes. The steadily increasing knowledge he acquires as a result of his policy, the growing sense of control over his existence, the growing self-confidence, the conviction of living in a universe that is open to him, all serve to put every emotional incentive on the side of his continuing to think. Further, they reduce the possibility of an incentive that could even tempt him to evade. It is too clear to him that reality is not and can never be his enemy, that he has nothing to gain from self-inflicted blindness and everything to lose. No, this does not mean that, for such a man, the policy of rationality becomes automatic. It will always remain volitional, but he has programmed himself, as it were, to have every emotional incentive for rationality and none for irrationality. To borrow a phrase from Aristotle, he has learned to make rationality second nature to him. That is the psychological reward he earns for himself. But, and this must be emphasized, his psychological state must be maintained volitionally. He retains the power to betray it. In each new issue he encounters, he still must choose to think.
Conversely, the more a man maintains a policy of focusing as little as possible, and of evading any facts he finds painful to consider, the more he sabotages himself psychologically and the more difficult the task of thinking becomes for him. The inevitable consequences of his policy of non-thinking are feelings of helplessness, of inefficacy, or anxiety, the sense of living in an unknowable and inimical universe. These feelings undercut his confidence in his ability to think, in the usefulness of thinking, and he tends to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of the mental chaos in himself which he has to untangle. Further, the countless fears to which his policy of evasion inevitably condemns him puts the weight of his emotions on the side of additional evasions, of growing self-deception, of an increasingly frantic flight from reality. No, this does not mean that his evasion and irrationality become automatic. They remain volitional, but he has programmed himself to find rationality harder and harder, and the temptation to evasion stronger and stronger. That is the psychological punishment which his nature imposes on him for his default. But he retains the power to change his course. This side of psychosis, and assuming no interfering structural or chemical disorders, every man retains that power, regardless of his previous mental practices. Volition pertains exclusively to one issue: is awareness the goal of one's consciousness, or not? What repeated evasion and irrationality can affect is not the ability to choose to focus, but the efficiency, speed, and productiveness of a given thinking process. Since the habitual evader has spent his time, not on improving the efficacy of his mind, but on sabotaging it, he suffers the consequences in terms of mental strain, slowness, internal chaos, when he does decide to think. If he perseveres, he can redeem and raise the efficacy of his thinking. But the mental effort he refused to exert formerly must now be exerted tenfold. In a given moment, a man may be so overcome by a violent emotion, particularly fear, that he may find it difficult or impossible to think clearly. But he has the power to know that he is in this state, and, unless instant action is required, to defer acting or drawing final conclusions until his mind has cleared. In this manner, he can remain in control even under acute stress. It is worth mentioning, in passing, that the more a man surrenders to his emotions in non-acute situations, when he could have easily done otherwise, the more susceptible he is to becoming psychologically incapacitated and helplessly blinded under pressure. He has no firmly established habit of rational self-discipline to support him.
An incentive is not a necessitating cause. The fact that a man has a good reason to want to think about some issue does not guarantee that he will do so. It does not compel him to think. And the fact that a man is afraid to think about some issue does not make it impossible for him to do so. It does not compel him to evade. A man's behavior, i.e., his actions, proceed from his values and premises, which in turn proceed, in the context of the knowledge available to him, from his thinking or non-thinking. His actions may be said to be free in that they are under the control of a faculty which is free, i.e., which functions volitionally. This is the reason why a man is held responsible for his actions. As to a man's desires and emotions, a man cannot will them in or out of existence directly, but he is not compelled to act on them if and when he considers them inappropriate. A desire or an emotion is a value response, the automatic product of an estimate, conscious or subconscious, and an estimate is the product of an individual's values and premises, conscious or subconscious, as the individual applies them to a given situation. Chapter 5. Man can alter his desires and emotions only by revising the thinking or non-thinking that produced his values and premises.
Volition and the social environment. A man's social environment can provide incentives to think, or it can make the task harder, according to the degree of human rationality or irrationality that a man encounters. But the social environment cannot determine a man's thinking or non-thinking. It cannot force him to exert the effort and accept the responsibility of cognition, and it cannot force him to evade. It cannot force him to subordinate his desires to his reason, and it cannot force him to sacrifice his reason to his desires. In this issue, man is inviolably a self-regulator. The social environment can provide him with incentives for good or for evil, but, to repeat, an incentive is not a necessitating cause. The environment consists only of facts. The meaning of those facts, the conclusions and convictions to be drawn from them, can be identified only by a man's mind. A man's character, the degree of his rationality, independence, honesty, is determined, not by the things he perceives, but by the thinking he does or fails to do about them. At any step of the way, a man can make honest mistakes of knowledge or judgment. He is not infallible. He may identify incorrectly the meaning or the significance of the events he observes. His power of volition does not guarantee him protection against errors, but it does guarantee that he need not be left helplessly at the mercy of his errors for the rest of his life. He is able to leave his mind open to new evidence that can inform him that his conclusions are wrong and must be revised. If, for instance, a child is brought up by irrational parents who give him a bewildering, frightening, and contradictory impression of reality, he may decide that all human beings by their nature are incomprehensible and dangerous to him. And if he arrests his thinking at this point, if, in later years, he never attempts to question or overcome his chronic feeling of terror and helplessness, he can spend the rest of his life in a state of embittered paralysis. But such does not have to be his fate. If he continues to struggle with the problem, or as he grows older, if he decides to consider the new, wider evidence available to him, he can discover that he has made an unwarranted generalization and he can reject it in favor of a fully reasoned and conscious conviction. Another child in the same circumstances may draw a different conclusion. He may decide that all human beings are unreliable and evil, and that he will beat them at their own game. He will act as ruthlessly and dishonestly as possible, to hurt them before they hurt him. Again, he can revise this conclusion later in the light of wider evidence, if he chooses to think about it. The facts of reality available to him will give him many opportunities to perceive that he is wrong. If he doesn't choose to think, he will become a scoundrel, not because his parents were irrational, but because he defaulted on the responsibility of forming his convictions consciously and of constantly checking them against the facts of reality.
A third child, in the same circumstances, may decide that his parents are wrong, that they are unjust and unfair, or at least that they do not act intelligibly, and that he must not act as they do. He may suffer at home, but keep looking for evidence of better human behavior, among neighbors or in books and movies, refusing to resign himself to the irrational and the incomprehensible as inevitable. Such a child will draw an enormous advantage out of his misfortune, which he will not realize until many years later. He will have laid the foundation of a profound self-confidence. If an adolescent grows up in a neighborhood where crime flourishes and is cynically accepted as the normal, he can, abdicating the independence of his judgment, allow his character to be shaped in the image of the prevailing values, and become a criminal himself, or, choosing to think, he can perceive the irrationality and humiliating self-degradation of those who accept a criminal's mode of existence, and fight to achieve a better way of life for himself. If a man is pounded from childhood with the doctrine of original sin, if he is taught that he is corrupt by nature and must spend his life in penance, if he is taught that this earth is a place of misery, frustration, and calamity, if he is taught that the pursuit of enjoyment is evil, he does not have to believe it. He is free to think, to question, and to judge the nature of a moral code that damns man and damns existence and places its standard of the good outside of both. Of any value offered to him as the right, and any assertion offered to him as the true, a man is free to ask, why? That why is the threshold that the beliefs of others cannot cross without his consent. It is conceivable, of course, that a young child could be subjected, from the first months and years of his life, to such extraordinarily vicious irrationality, such bewildering, contradictory, and terrifying behavior on the part of his parents, that it would be impossible for him to develop normally, because of the limited evidence available to him. It might be impossible for him to establish any firm base of knowledge on which to build. It is conceivable that a child could be paralyzed psychologically or severely retarded mentally in this manner. But this would represent the destruction, not the conditioning, of a child's mind, and this is not what is meant by those who claim that man is a product of his background. Let us consider the case of the individual who does appear to be the product of his background, of his social environment. Let us analyze, as an example, the case of the boy who, brought up in a bad neighborhood, becomes a criminal. In the actions of a boy who thus allows himself to be shaped by his environment, the most obviously apparent motive is the desire to swim with the current. The root of that desire is the wish to escape the effort and responsibility of initiating his own course of action. In order to choose one's own actions, one has to choose one's own goals, and to do that, one has to choose one's own values, and to do that, one has to think. But thinking is the first and basic responsibility that such a boy rejects. Having no values or standards of his own, he is led, by his desire for security, to accept whatever values are offered to him by the social group in which he finds himself. To swim with the current, one has to accept the ocean or the swamp or the rapids or the cesspool or the abyss, toward which that particular current is rushing. Such a boy will want to swim with the current, he will want to follow any course of action ready-made for him by others, he will want to belong. And so, if the boys in the neighborhood form a gang at the corner pool room, he will join. If they start robbing people, he will start robbing people. If they begin to murder, he will murder. What moves him is his feelings. His feelings are all he has left, once he has abandoned his mind. He does not join the gang by a conscious, reasoned decision, he feels like joining. He does not follow the gang because he honestly thinks they are right, he feels like following. If his mother objects and tries to argue with him, to persuade him to quit the hoodlums, he does not weigh her arguments, he does not conclude that she is wrong, he does not feel like thinking about it.
If, at some point, he begins to fear that the gang may be going too far, if he recoils from the prospect of becoming a murderer, he realizes that the alternative is to break with his friends and be left on his own. He does not weigh the advantages or disadvantages of being left on his own. He chooses blindly to stick with the gang, because he feels terror at the prospect of independence. He may see, across the river or just a few blocks away, people who lead a totally different kind of life, and boys of his own age who, somehow, did not become criminals. He has many means of access to a wider view of the possibilities of life, but this does not raise in his mind the question whether a better kind of life is possible for him. It does not prompt him to inquire or investigate, because he feels terror of the unknown. If he asks himself what it is that terrifies him about breaking with his background, he will answer, in effect, I don't know nobody out there and nobody knows me. In reason, this is not an explanation, there is nothing objectively terrifying in that statement, but it satisfies him, because he feels an overwhelming dread of loneliness, and feelings are his only absolute, the absolute not to be questioned. And if, at the age of 20, he is dragged to jail to await execution for some monstrously bloody and senselessly wanton crime, he will scream that he could not help it and that he never had a chance. He will not scream it because it is true. He will scream it because he feels it. In a sense opposite to that which he intends, there is one element of truth in his scream. Given his basic policy of anti-thought, he could not help it and he never had a chance. Neither has any other human being who moves through life on that sort of policy. But it is not true that he or any other human being could not help running from the necessity to think, could not help riding blindly on his feelings. On every day of this boy's life and at every crucial turning point, the possibility of thinking about his actions was open to him. The evidence on which to base a change in his policy was available to him. He evaded it. He chose not to think. If, at every turning point, he had thought carefully and conscientiously, and had simply reached the wrong conclusions, he would be more justified in crying that he could not help it. But it is not helplessly bewildered, conscientious thinkers who fill reform schools and who murder one another on street corners, through an error in logic. If one wishes to understand what destroyed this boy, the key lies, not in his environment, but in the fact that he let himself be moved, guided, and motivated by his feelings, that he tried to substitute his feelings for his mind. There was nothing to prevent him from thinking, except that he did not feel like it. To the extent that a man defaults on the responsibility of thinking, he is, in significant measure, the product of his environment. But such is not the nature of man. It is an instance of pathology. The attempt of most psychologists to explain a man's behavior without reference to the degree of his thinking or non-thinking, by attempting to reduce all of a man's behavior to causes either in his conditioning or in his heredity, is profoundly indicative of the extent to which man is absent from and ignored by most current psychological theories. According to the view prevalent today, man is only a walking recorder into which his parents, teachers, and neighbors dictate what they please, such parents, teachers, and neighbors themselves being only walking recorders carrying the dictations of other, earlier recorders, and so on. As to the question of where new ideas, concepts, and values come from, it is left unanswered. The helpless chunk of putty, which allegedly is man, produces them by virtue of some chance concatenation of unknown forces. It is interesting to consider the personal confession contained in the social determinists' dismay, incredulity, and indignation at the suggestion that original, self-generated thinking plays any significant role in a man's life.
The contradiction of determinism, free will, in the widest meaning of the term, is the doctrine that man is capable of performing actions which are not determined by forces outside his control, that man is capable of making choices which are not necessitated by antecedent factors. As one writer formulates it, in the case of an action that is free, it must be such that it is caused by the agent who performs it, but such that no antecedent conditions were sufficient for performing just that action. The nature of these free choices, to what human faculty they pertain, how they operate and what are their limits, are questions on which various theories of free will differ. Predominantly, theories of free will have attempted to argue that certain desires or physical actions are free, i.e., causally irreducible, a position that is flagrantly insupportable. Man's free will consists of a single action, a single basic choice, to think or not to think. It is a freedom entailed by his unique power of self-consciousness. This basic choice, given the context of his knowledge and of the existential possibilities confronting him, controls all of man's other choices, and directs the course of his actions. The concept of man as a being of volitional consciousness stands in sharp opposition to the view that dominates our culture in general and the social sciences in particular, the doctrine of psychological determinism. Psychological determinism denies the existence of any element of freedom or volition in man's consciousness. It holds that, in relation to his actions, decisions, values, and conclusions, man is ultimately and essentially passive, that man is merely a reactor to internal and external pressures, that those pressures determine the course of his actions and the content of his convictions, just as physical forces determine the course of every particle of dust in the universe. It holds that, in any given situation or moment, only one choice is psychologically possible to man, the inevitable result of all the antecedent determining forces impinging on him, just as only one action is possible to the speck of dust, that man has no actual power of choice, no actual freedom or self-responsibility. Man, according to this view, has no more volition than a stone, he is merely confronted with more complex alternatives and is manipulated by more complex forces. Although they usually do not care to have it formulated so explicitly, nor to accept its full implications, this is the view of man's nature that most contemporary psychologists accept. They accept it, many of them candidly admit, as an article of faith. That is, the majority do not claim that this view has been proven, has been logically demonstrated. They profess a belief in psychological determinism because they regard it as scientific. This is the single most prevalent and destructive myth in the field of psychology today. The doctrine of determinism contains a central and insuperable contradiction, an epistemological contradiction, a contradiction implicit in any variety of determinism, whether the alleged determining forces be physical, psychological, environmental, or divine.
The determinist view of mind maintains that whether a man thinks or not, whether he takes cognizance of the facts of reality or not, whether he places facts above feelings or feelings above facts, all are determined by forces outside his control. In any given moment or situation, his method of mental functioning is the inevitable product of an endless chain of antecedent factors. He has no choice in the matter. That which a man does, declare the advocates of determinism, he had to do; that which he believes, he had to believe; if he focuses his mind, he had to; if he evades the effort of focusing, he had to; if he is guided solely by reason, he had to be; if he is ruled instead by feeling or whim, he had to be; he couldn't help it. But if this were true, no knowledge, no conceptual knowledge, would be possible to man. No theory could claim greater plausibility than any other, including the theory of psychological determinism. Man is neither omniscient nor infallible. This means, A, that he must work to achieve his knowledge, and B, that the mere presence of an idea inside his mind does not prove that the idea is true. Many ideas may enter a man's mind which are false. But if man believes what he has to believe, if he is not free to test his beliefs against reality, and to validate or reject them, if the actions and content of his mind are determined by factors that may or may not have anything to do with reason, logic, and reality, then he can never know if his conclusions are true or false.
Knowledge consists of the correct identification of the facts of reality, and in order for man to know that the contents of his mind do constitute knowledge, in order for him to know that he has identified the facts of reality correctly, he requires a means of testing his conclusions. The means is the process of reasoning, of testing his conclusions against reality, and checking for contradictions. But this validation is possible only if his capacity to judge is free, i.e., non-conditional, given a normal brain. If his capacity to judge is not free, there is no way for a man to discriminate between his beliefs and those of a raving lunatic. But then how did the advocates of determinism acquire their knowledge? What is its validation? Determinists are conspicuously silent on this point. If the advocates of determinism insist that their choice to think and their acceptance of reason is conditional, dependent on factors outside their control, which means that they are not free to test their beliefs against the facts of reality, then they cannot claim to know that their theory is true, they can only report that they feel helpless to believe otherwise. Nor can they claim that their theory is highly probable, they can only acknowledge the inner compulsion that forbids them to doubt that it is highly probable. Some advocates of determinism, evidently sensing this epistemological dilemma, have sought to escape it by asserting that, although they are determined to believe what they believe, the factor determining them is logic. But by what means do they know this? Their beliefs are no more subject to their control than those of a lunatic. They and the lunatic are equally the pawn of deterministic forces. Both are incapable of judging their judgments. One of the defining characteristics of psychosis is loss of volitional control over rational judgment, but, according to determinism, that is man's normal, metaphysical state. There is no escape from determinism's epistemological dilemma.
A mind that is not free to test and validate its conclusions. A mind whose judgment is not free can have no way to tell the logical from the illogical, no way to ascertain that which compels and motivates it. No right to claim knowledge of any kind. Such a mind is disqualified for such appraisals by its very nature. The very concept of logic is possible only to a volitional consciousness. An automatic consciousness could have no need of it, and could not conceive of it. The concepts of logic, thought, and knowledge are not applicable to machines. A machine does not reason. It performs the actions its builder sets it to perform, and those actions alone. If it is set to register that 2 + 2 = 4, it does so. If it is set to register that 2 + 2 = 5, it does so. It has no power to correct the orders and information given it. If self-correctors are built into it, it performs the prescribed acts of self-correction, and no others. If the self-correctors are set incorrectly, it cannot correct itself. It cannot make any independent, self-generated contribution to its own performance. If man, who is not set invariably to be right, or merely a super-complex machine, engineered by his heredity and operated by his environment, pushed, pulled, shaped, and molded by his genes, his toilet training, his parental upbringing, and his cultural history, then no idea reached by him could claim objectivity or truth, including the idea that man is a machine. Those who propound determinism must either assert that they arrived at their theory by mystical revelation, and thus exclude themselves from the realm of reason, or they must assert that they are an exception to the theory they propound, and thus exclude their theory from the realm of truth. The fact that knowledge is possible to man cannot be contested without self-contradiction. It is a truth that must be accepted even in the act of seeking to dispute it. Any theory that necessitates the conclusion that man can know nothing is self-invalidating and self-refuting by that very fact. Yet such is the conclusion to which the theory of determinism inescapably leads. In appraising any theory of the nature of man's mind and its operations, it is necessary to consider that, since the theory is itself a product of man's mind, its claim to truth must be compatible with its own existence and content. Otherwise, the theory is contradictory and nonsensical, Bertrand Russell's theory of types notwithstanding. For example, if a man were to declare, as an alleged fact of reality, man is incapable of knowing any facts, the logical absurdity of his statement would be obvious. The epistemological contradiction of determinism is, in a subtler and more complex way, of the identical order.
Determinism is a theory whose claim to truth is incompatible with its own content. It exhibits what may be termed the fallacy of self-exclusion. A number of thinkers, attacking the theory of classical associationism, have pointed out that the associationist theory of mind does not allow the possibility of ever establishing associationism as true, that the theory does not allow the possibility of any knowledge. But associationism is merely one version of psychological determinism. What has not been recognized is that the same objection applies to, and invalidates, any version of determinism. It does not matter whether man's mind is alleged to be passively under the sway of the laws of association, or of conditioned reflexes, or of environmental pressures, or of original sin. Any theory of mind that denies man's volitional control over his faculty of judgment collapses under the weight of the same inescapable and insuperable contradiction. Only because man is a being of volitional consciousness, only because he is free to initiate and sustain a reasoning process, is conceptual knowledge, in contradistinction to irresistible, unchosen beliefs, possible to him.
Volition and the law of causality. Two notions, both mistaken, are especially influential in propagating the mystique of psychological determinism. The first is the claim that psychological determinism is logically entailed by the law of causality, that volition contradicts causality. The second is the claim that, without determinism, no science of psychology would be possible, there could be no psychological laws and no way to predict human behavior. What is involved in the first of these claims is a gross misapprehension of the nature of the law of causality. Let us begin by considering the exact meaning of this law. As Ayn Rand writes, "The law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. All actions are caused by entities. The nature of an action is caused and determined by the nature of the entities that act. A thing cannot act in contradiction to its nature." 3. This is the first point that must be stressed. All actions are actions of entities. The concept of action logically requires and presupposes that which acts, and would not be possible without it. The universe consists of entities that act, move, and change, not of disembodied actions, motions, and changes. The actions possible to an entity are determined by its nature. What a thing can do depends on what it is. It is not chance. It is not the whim of a supernatural being. It is in the inexorable nature of the entities involved that a seed can grow into a flower, but a stone cannot. That electricity can run a motor, but tears and prayers cannot. That actions consistent with their natures are possible to entities, but contradictions are not. Just as what a thing can do depends on what it is, so, in any specific situations, what a thing will do depends on what it is. If iron is exposed to a certain temperature, it expands. If water is exposed to the same temperature, it boils. If wood is exposed to the same temperature, it burns. The differences in their actions are caused by differences in their properties. If an automobile collides with a bicycle, it is not chance that the bicycle is hurled into the air, rather than the automobile. If an automobile collides with a train, it is not chance that the automobile is hurled into the air, rather than the train. Causality proceeds from identity. Causality pertains to a relationship between entities and their actions. The law of causality is a very wide abstraction. Per se, it does not specify the kind of causal processes that are operative in any particular entity, and it does not imply that the same kinds of causal processes are operative in all entities. Any such assumption would be gratuitous and unwarranted. The actions of a stone, for example, are only reactions to other objects or forces. A stone, which moves by a mechanistic type of causation, cannot initiate actions. It cannot start rolling down a hillside, unless it is pushed by a man's hand or by the wind or by some other force outside itself. It can generate neither actions nor goals. But an animal possesses the power of locomotion. It can initiate movement, goal-directed movement. It can start walking or running. The source of its motion is within itself. That the animal may start running in response to the perception of some stimulus object is irrelevant in this context. What is relevant is that the animal has the capacity to respond in a manner impossible to a stone, by originating, within its own body, the motion of running, and by moving toward a goal. Different causal processes, different principles of action, are involved in these two cases.
The nature of a living entity gives it the capacity for a kind of action impossible to inanimate matter, self-generated, goal-directed action, in the sense defined above. Man's greatest distinction from all other living species is the capacity to originate an action of his consciousness, the capacity to originate a process of abstract thought. Man's unique responsibility lies in the fact that this process of thought, which is man's basic means of survival, must be originated volitionally. In man, there exists the power of choice, choice in the primary sense, choice as a psychologically irreducible natural fact. This freedom of choice is not a negation of causality, but a category of it, a category that pertains to man. A process of thought is not causeless, it is caused by a man. The actions possible to an entity are determined by the entity that acts, and the nature of man, and of man's mind, is such that it necessitates the choice between focusing and non-focusing, between thinking and non-thinking. Man's nature does not allow him to escape this choice. It is his alone to make. It is not made for him by the gods, the stars, the chemistry of his body, the structure of his family constellation, or the economic organization of his society. If one is to be bound by a genuine empiricism, i.e., a respect for observable facts, without arbitrary commitments to which reality must be adjusted, one cannot ignore this distinctive attribute of man's nature. And if one understands the law of causality as a relationship between entities and their actions, then the problem of reconciling volition and causality is seen to be illusory. But it is not thus that the law of causality is regarded today. That is the source of the confusion. The historical turning point came at the Renaissance. Windelband, in his A History of Philosophy, describes it as follows: the idea of cause had acquired a completely new significance through Galileo. According to the conception, causes were substances or things, while effects, on the other hand, were either their activities or were other substances and things which were held to come about only by such activities. This was the Platonic Aristotelian conception. Galileo, on the contrary, went back to the idea of the older Greek thinkers, who applied the causal relation only to the states, that meant now to the motions of substances, not to the being of the substances themselves. Causes are motions, and effects are motions. For this was the view that dominated post-Renaissance science and philosophy. Causality was seen as a relationship between actions and actions, not between entities and actions. The model of causality was mechanics. The essence of the causal relationship was identified with the relationship of impact and counter-impact, of action and reaction. Long after the time when the mechanical model was recognized by physicists as inapplicable to many aspects of the physical world, i.e., inapplicable even to many inanimate, deterministic systems within the universe, electromagnetic phenomena, for example, a disastrous legacy remained: the insidiously persistent notion that every action, including every action of man, is only a reaction to some antecedent action or motion or force.
The view of causality as a relationship between motions is entirely spurious. It is worth noting that, if one accepts this view, there is no way to prove or validate the law of causality. If all that is involved is motion succeeding motion, there is no way to establish necessary relationships between succeeding events. One observes that B follows A, but one has no way to establish that B is the effect or consequence of A. This, incidentally, is one of the reasons why most philosophers, who accept this notion of causality, have been unable to answer Hume's argument that one cannot prove the law of causality. One can't, unless one grasps its relationship to the law of identity. But this entails rejecting the motion-to-motion view of causality. Furthermore, the motion-to-motion view obscures the explanatory nature of the law of causality. If one wishes to understand why entities act as they do, in a given context, one must seek the answer through an understanding of the properties of the entities involved. And, in fact, any explanation via references to antecedent actions always implies and presupposes this understanding. For example, if one states that the action of a wastebasket catching fire was caused by the action of a lighted match being thrown into it, this constitutes a satisfactory causal explanation only if one understands the nature of paper and of lighted matches. A description of the action sequence, in the absence of such knowledge, would explain nothing. The premise that every action is only a reaction to an antecedent action rules out, arbitrarily and against the evidence, the existence of self-generated, goal-directed action. The way in which this premise has impeded progress in the science of biology is outside the scope of this discussion. What is directly pertinent here is the disastrous consequences of this premise for psychology. It is this premise that forbids men to grasp the possibility of a volitional consciousness. On this premise, thinking or non-thinking is merely a necessitated reaction to an antecedent necessitated reaction to an antecedent necessitated reaction, etc. Such a view makes man wholly passive. It is entirely incompatible with the fact of man as a cognitive self-regulator. But it is not the fact of cognitive self-regulation that must be questioned and rejected, it is the mistaken notion of causality. It is an error to demand, what made one man choose to focus and another man choose to evade? This question almost invariably reflects the mistaken notion of causality we have just discussed above. The question implies one's failure to grasp the meaning of choice in the primary sense involved in the act of focusing or thinking. The questioner is asking, to what is the action of focusing or thinking a reaction? As applied to physical nature, determinism may be regarded, and commonly is regarded, as synonymous with universal causality. But as applied to man, i.e., in a psychological context, the term has a narrower meaning, as defined above, which is not entailed by the law of causality and which is demonstrably at variance with the facts. Now, let us consider the issue of psychological law and prediction.
Man's consciousness or mind has a specific nature, it has a specific structure, it has specific attributes, it has specific powers. Its manner of functioning exhibits specific principles or laws, which it is the task of psychology to discover and identify. None of this is contradicted by the fact that the exercise of man's reason is volitional. His mind is an organ over which man has a specific, delimited, regulatory control. Just as the driver of an automobile can steer the car in a chosen direction, but cannot alter or infringe the mechanical laws by which the car functions, so man can choose to focus, to aim his cognitive faculty in a given direction, but cannot alter or infringe the psychological laws by which his mind functions. If a man does not steer his car properly, he has no choice about the fact that he will end in a smash-up, neither has the man who does not steer his mind properly. For example, a man is free to think or not to think, but he is not free to escape the fact that if he fails to think, if he characteristically evades facing any facts or issues which he finds unpleasant, he will set in motion a complex chain of destructive psychological consequences, one of which will be a profound loss of self-esteem. This is a matter of demonstrable psychological law, Chapter 7. Or again, if a man forms certain values, as a result of his thinking or non-thinking, these values will lead him to experience certain emotions in certain situations. He will not be able to command these emotions out of existence by will. If he recognizes that a specific emotion is inappropriate, he can alter it by rethinking the value, S, that evokes it, but he can do so only in a specific, lawful manner, not by arbitrary whim, Chapter 5. Free will does not mean arbitrary, omnipotent power, unlimited power over the workings of one's own mind. Thus, to the extent that one understands the principles by which man's mind operates, one can predict the psychological consequences of given ideas, values, conclusions, attitudes, and thinking policies. One can predict, for example, that a man of authentic self-esteem will find intellectual stagnation intolerable, that a man who regards sex, life, and himself as evil will not be attracted to a woman of intelligence, independence, and guiltless self-confidence, will not feel at ease and at home with her romantically, that a man whose guiding policy is don't antagonize anyone, will not be the first to stand up for and champion a radical new idea or theory. One cannot predict with certainty that these men will not change their thinking. Therefore, one's predictions must take the form of all other things being equal, or assuming no new factors enter the situation. But this is true of prediction in the physical sciences also. If one is to understand man psychologically, a cardinal requirement is that one identify the fact of volition.
A genuinely scientific psychology must repudiate the mystique of determinism and the spurious theory of causality on which it rests.